Welcome to the Lessons for Luca podcast. I'm your host, Michael Santi, a transformational trainer and coach, author of New Man Emerging, and most importantly, I'm Luca's dad. Gentlemen, we need to talk trauma. And I want to bring up the conversation around trauma, but I want to approach it in a unique way so that it's usable and digestible and workable, that there's a bit more of an invitation to look at some of the ways that old traumas and old wounds are actually influencing the way that we're showing up today in our marriages, in our health, in our relationships, in our relationship with ourselves, with other people, with our relationship with our finances. It spreads across every domain and spreads across the board. And I want to approach it from a unique angle. Years ago, when I first started coaching, trauma wasn't really a word that was brought up often outside of clinical environments. It was very specific. It was specific to military and to first responders and to really big abuses that people could clearly identify. It's now become part of our cultural narrative and it's infused in our cultural lexicon. Years ago, if someone brought it up, there would still be a level of stigma to it. It was something that was unspoken about. It was something that had more shame attached to it. Now, we hear about it everywhere. And there's a fine line and a double-edged sword to that. Now that it is in our cultural narrative, a lot of times people over-identify with it or don't necessarily know exactly what it is and how to orient with it. So now that it is in our cultural lexicon, you have a whole polarization of don't talk about it, stop talking about it, I won't talk about it, all the way to the other end, which is that's all I want to talk about, all I want to identify with, and that's who I am, and now it's made me a victim or powerless to my current state or to my future state. So I want to look at this and look at trauma actually on a broad spectrum. If you think of physical trauma, there is on one end of the spectrum, there could be a break in the ankle. And on the other end of the spectrum, there could just simply be a minor sprain. But they all make the body cope with that trauma. And it's a very broad spectrum. Well, it's the same thing emotionally and psychologically. So there's this broad spectrum. And as we unravel this and we put actually some new language to it, I think it'll give us a better opportunity to interface and relate with it more effectively. The word trauma its origins are Greek for wound. Trauma simply means that there was a wound, physically, mentally, spiritually, or emotionally. That there was, at a certain point, I was wounded. Some of those traumas are actually healthy. For instance, a surgery trauma, in order to correct something, we've got to go in and wound or cut the body or reposition something. And then the body over time adapts to that wound. It can adapt in a more sustainably healthy way, or it can orient around a level of dysfunction, which we'll talk about. So the word wound, that trauma, a lot of us have very specific moments in time where we felt physically, mentally, spiritually, or emotionally wounded. And so when we look at that in our point of origin, our personal history, our family dynamic when we're young and we're forming our worldview in our formative years as children, we have a family dynamic, a cultural dynamic. Those specific wounds, those specific abuses, those are what we call life-defining events. A life-defining event is a very specific moment in time where that wound occurred, that there was me beforehand and me after, that there was a very specific moment in time where I can remember a loss, a death, a divorce, a sickness, an accident, an abuse, that it's a very specific moment in time. The market crashed and my family lost everything. I was abused by one of my parents, or, one of my parents passed away or got sick, or that my parents divorced. Some actual specific moment in time in our personal history or in our point of origin. That's called a life-defining event. Less specific is when we look at our point of origin and, let's say, our family dynamic, or the way my parents were with each other, the way that my parents were with me or my brothers or our sisters, or the way our culture formed and informed and shaped us. So it's not one specific moment in time. It's more of a consistent water that I swam in when I was young. That's called a life-defining dynamic. It's not one specific moment. It's actually many moments consistently over time. So for instance, the dynamic of how our parents were with money, how they were with conflict. Did they default to anger? Was my father or my mother unpredictable? So I really didn't know which parent was going to show up on which day and how they were going to be. Did we just sweep things under the rug, not talk about things? In certain cultures, especially in the East, there's a cultural dynamic where, let's say, the firstborn son has a lot more pressure on them than the rest of the children. That's a cultural dynamic. That's water that they swim in. There's how we dealt with conflict, how we dealt with money, the way my parents were with each other, with themselves, with their health. That's not one specific moment in time. That's just simply a dynamic that growing up, I normalized. That growing up, I simply familiarized and said, this just must be the way that it is. Because I'm learning all of that through my dynamic, through predominantly my caretakers or the family dynamic. Those are life-defining dynamics. Now, when we look at trauma or wound, sometimes it's actually harder for people with life-defining dynamics to identify where they're oriented to a dysfunction. For people with a life-defining event, sometimes it's more clear and more obvious that I was a particular way, this wound or trauma happened, and then the river of my life changed course. Sometimes, and I'm not saying one is more preferable than the other, but sometimes life-defining events are easier to identify because they're specific. They're actual moments in time. Where I find in my coaching and clientele, identifying and illuminating life-defining dynamics is actually harder for people. Because there's a part of the human brain as well that we default to romanticize history and catastrophize the future. That's not a character flaw. That's part of our survival mechanism. That when we look back on history, we tend to romanticize it. We tend to say, you know what, it was great. Everything worked out smoothly. But when we look to the future, there's a part of our reptilian brain that actually wants to judge and find what's going to go wrong, what's out, where can I protect myself by finding the things that are wrong. It's just a part of the human makeup for survival. So when we identify or try to excavate life-defining dynamics, oftentimes it's actually harder than saying, yes, this moment in time, this is where the river of my life changed. So as we start to explore trauma, I want to put a distinct language to it. Rather than wound, I actually want to angle and approach trauma as an imprint. That there's certain things in life, in my history, in my point of origin, that left an imprint on me. It left a certain imprint, and when I was young, I oriented to that imprint. If you think of if you are hiking on a trail on a mountain and you're on a cliff and there's a pebble in your shoe and you cannot stop and take your boot off and just get the pebble out. If there's a pebble in your shoe and you can't stop to get that pebble out of your boot, you will orient how you walk because that pebble is in your shoe. Every time you step and it's painful, you're going to adjust your gait. You're going to adjust where you step. You're going to adjust how hard you step. And you're going to do that and you're going to orient to that until you're able to get off the cliff, get to safety, take your boot off and get rid of the pebble. Now, if you walk with that pebble for long enough, you'll actually get so conditioned to orient with the pebble in your boot that later on, when you take the pebble out, it's actually strange, uncomfortable, or unfamiliar. And so that's a really important process or an important distinction to say, what left an imprint on me and how did I orient to that imprint? And have I corrected that imprint, or is that imprint and that orientation still showing up today in my marriage, in my quickness to impatience or anger, in the way I relate with my health or my wealth, my relationships, myself? So when we look at imprint, now we could actually pull away a bit of the stigma and we could say with honesty or with neutrality or with clarity, like, what left an imprint on me? Another analogy of that is if I take this massive mound of clay, a life-defining event would be more like taking one good swing at the clay and leaving a decent imprint. With one swing, I can make a decent imprint in the clay. This one trauma, this one wound, this one imprint. In one shot, I can make a decent imprint by taking a punch at that clay. A life-defining dynamic would more be like every day for 10 years, I come up and just press the clay. And then the next day I press the clay. And the next day I press the clay. Now, it won't make a massive imprint immediately, but if you do that for long enough, for years, for a decade or two, I could actually make a deeper imprint in that clay than the one massive shot. So when we look at trauma or wounds as imprints, we're actually saying, like, what is the moment, the event, or the dynamic that left imprints on me? And when I was young, how did I orient to that imprint? The way that we orient to that imprint in our point of origin is as we are developing our worldview and we are going through our formative years, physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally, we create certain narratives and we create certain behaviors, we create certain postures, either to inform us about that wound or imprint or to actually try or attempt to bypass it. In our point of origin, our main motivating factors when we're young is to get love, attention, acceptance, affection, and approval. It's to simply get love, attention, acceptance, affection, and approval. And when we're formative and building our personalities and our worldview, especially with our caretakers or with our family dynamic, we start to conclude what gets me love, attention, acceptance, affection, and approval, or when is it withheld? So if we take a life-defining dynamic and let's say, every time I brought home A's, my parents were really proud, and every time I fell short or I failed or I didn't do very well, they would ignore me or tell me that I wasn't good enough or anything like that. Well, as a kid, I'm going to orient to that. I'm going to develop certain behaviors around that. I'm going to develop certain postures around that. I might think that love equals accomplishment, that to get attention equals I've got to be perfect and make everybody happy. those dynamics that we imprint to, we start to practice them because we're actually getting love, attention, acceptance, affection, or approval, or we feel like we're losing it or it's being withheld. And so that's how we begin to orient around these dynamics, around these imprints. And so as we're growing up, we are constantly orienting. We are stepping on that pebble, and if it hurts, we orient our walk. If it feels okay, we keep practicing and doing it. And the important point here is that humans don't default to what's healthy. We default to what's familiar. When we default to what's familiar, or when we're young and we orient to something unhealthy or dysfunctional, we are just constantly informing ourselves that this is the way that it is. And now, years later and decades later, we're orienting and projecting and practicing what we have familiarized. So if you think of an abuse or a dynamic in our point of origin, if you think of a family dynamic where all we did was argue, we had no real effective communication, no effective skill set to communicate or communicate calmly, that left an imprint. I orient around that imprint, and then I bring that into adulthood, and I don't really have the skill sets now to communicate effectively or with patience or non-aggressively. That left an imprint. I oriented around that imprint, and now I've practiced it for decades, and now that's what shows up today. Well, the objective here, with a level of honesty and neutrality, is to actually say that in my point of origin, the way that I oriented to that imprint was actually appropriate. But what I'm doing out of default or out of familiarity is I'm using an old appropriate coping mechanism at an inappropriate time now. That here I am with, let's say, my wife or a friend who wants to talk or wants to work through something, and I'm just thrown to this automatic reaction of my practicing of my orientation from that old imprint. And I don't really have the skill set here and now to have a relationship that thrives on teamwork and communication, because I haven't built that emotional skill set or that psychological skill set, because I keep orienting to what's familiar, not necessarily to what's healthy. That's what gets in our way. That's what operates under the surface, and we become so unaware of it because we've practiced it for decades. Remember, humans don't default to what's healthy. We default to what's familiar. So if I have practiced and made familiar not to trust people, to get impatient, to scream when I need to make my point heard, or make everyone happy, shut down and withdraw, or be loud to get attention. If I've practiced that for decades, I'm actually going to familiarize that so much that it's now going to be my default here in the present day. And there's areas in our life where that is not working. But instead of shifting into a new possibility or a new behavior, a new action or a new insight or a new way of being, we're unconsciously defaulting to what we familiarized. This past weekend, I ran a retreat that I've been doing for a few years called the Inner Freedom Retreat. And my partner in it, Ryan Suave, he's a brilliant therapist. He has this great analogy where here I am on this island, and I can see across the body of water, there's another island that I want to be at, and I have a boat. And every time I attempt to get to the island where I want to be, from the island I am to where the island I want to be is, every time I make an attempt to get there, I end up off course by, a mile. And then, so what we do is, well, let me get a better boat. Let me get a shinier boat, a faster boat. Let me polish the boat. And we try this journey over and over again, but we keep ending up off course. I keep saying this is the island I want to be on, but every attempt I make, I keep ending up over here. Well, the amount of attempts isn't changing anything. But what if I said that I am unaware that there is a 20-mile-an-hour current going sideways that is catching my boat every time I make an attempt? And that's what's actually throwing me off course. There is this current that is moving me that I am completely unaware of. And that current is our unconscious imprints. That current comes from our point of origin, completely upstream in our life and in our history. And it's actually, we've been orienting to that current all of our life. Well, if I don't factor that current in, no amount of attempts is going to get me to where I want to go. But the moment I actually illuminate that current and say, oh, wait a second, I'm unconsciously orienting to these old imprints, I can now factor that in. I could shed light on it. I can question it. I can challenge it. I could take new actions, or I could choose new ways of being from a psychological or an emotional standpoint. I can make new commitments to patience or vulnerability. I could see where this originated in me, and I could also see where I imprinted and oriented to it, and then where it's affecting my life now. I can actually interrupt that as long as I'm conscious of it. But if I'm unconscious of it, it's going to be the current that keeps moving my boat. And the amount of attempts that I make is never going to work out. Carl Jung put it brilliantly that he said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it'll operate and dictate our life, and we'll call it fate. That's what these imprints are doing. They are moving and influencing our life from upstream. And if upstream is polluted, no amount of work or effort downstream is going to fix that. It's not going to improve it. It's actually going to be a waste of my energy and effort to try and clean up downstream if upstream is still being polluted. And so as we look into our point of origin, again, always, it's not to go back to our point of origin and unpack and live there and become a victim to it. Going back to our point of origin and our history is there to inform us. It's to inform me the ways that I'm operating in my marriage or in my money or in my health or in my career or with my relationships or in my spiritual life. We go back to our history to be informed. And I want to gain that information because I want to discern, are some of those imprints and orientations effective to my life now and the life that I say I want to live? Or are some of those imprints and orientations ineffective? And am I orienting to something that was dysfunctional? Another way of putting that is, if I have widgets on a conveyor belt and there becomes, on this conveyor belt, there becomes this defect on the conveyor belt. Well, every widget after that is going to contain that defect. Well, if I can consciously intervene in that conveyor belt and I can remove the defect, it may take some time to get all those widgets with defects off of the conveyor belt. But what I've done is all of those widgets afterwards won't contain that defect anymore. And now what I can do is I can orient and operate in a whole new way. But as long as I'm unconscious to those defects are going to be in everything that I print going forward on that conveyor belt of my life. So these become really important to illuminate and even excavate upstream and in our point of origin. Again, not so that we go back and unpack and live there and be a victim to it, but that we use our history to inform us. If you think of, waking up every day, I don't want to wake up every day and relearn how to talk and relearn how to walk. My history simply informs me and informs my body that this is how you do this. Without illuminating life-defining events and life-defining dynamics and illuminating and shedding some light and some consciousness on those imprints, we are letting our history inform us to those levels of dysfunction. And what we could start to find with honesty and with discernment is some of those dysfunctions are actually harming our life. They're harming our relationships, harming our well-being, harming our prosperity, harming our success. I want to be able to look back at those imprints and with honesty and even with neutrality say, yeah, I see where I picked that up. I see where I oriented to it. It was appropriate then, but it's inappropriate now. It no longer works. I want to make a really important point here, which is in our point of origin, the way we oriented to those imprints, none of it is your fault. However, it is your responsibility to heal it. That certain things you picked up when you were young, you really had no other choice but to orient the way that you did. However, now it's your responsibility to correct it and heal it so that you don't pass it on to your children and to the future generations. That's our responsibility. Trauma and imprints and life-defining events and life-defining dynamics, they don't create our destiny, but they do influence the way we operate today. If some of those imprints are informing you and building success in your relationships and in your life and in your joy and your happiness and your fulfillment, then double down on them. But it's really up to you to actually identify which are the ones that are actually obstructing and getting in the way of the life that you genuinely want to live. That's up to you to unobstruct it, to clean it out, and to clear it. I also want to highlight that there's certain wounds and imprints and traumas that we do heal completely, and there's some that we simply learn how to live with. There's certain people that have passed away, loved ones that I have that I've lost. There's no way to bring them back or to have another cup of coffee with them. But by doing deeper work like this, I'm able to make space in my heart and live in such a way where, yes, I understand there's an emptiness or a void that'll never be filled up, but I've learned how to make meaning of it. I've learned how to make it purposeful. I've learned how to repurpose it in a way that inspires my life rather than contaminates it. And so certain imprints and wounds we can and want to heal completely, and some we want to learn just how to let them be there and operate and live our life in such a way that they're not destructive. And that's another opportunity, is that those imprints, those life-defining events, those life-defining dynamics, those imprints when we're young, some of them have created a tremendous amount of pain. And if we try to avoid actually alchemizing that pain and using that pain into something useful or inspirational, what we do is rather than use it and really allow ourselves to feel it, allow the body to process it, allow ourselves to heal it, if we don't do deeper work, if we don't do conscious work around some of our trauma, then the body really only has three options. One is to try and escape the pain, the other is to try and suppress the pain, and the other is to try and repress the pain. So if I have these life-defining events or moments in my life and I don't want to deal with it, one way is I can escape it. I could use substance, I could use drugs, I could use alcohol, I could use checking out, scrolling, pornography. I could use certain things that have me escape from the discomfort. Escaping it is unsustainable. It's actually harmful over time. The second option is I can suppress it, meaning psychologically I know it's there, but I don't want to deal with it. And so I just distract myself with working harder or running from it, or I know it's there, but I don't want to give it the energy. That's not free either, because the body and the and the psyche and the emotional body has to orient to keeping it suppressed. And the third is to repress it. That something upstream in my life was so traumatic that I just blocked it out. A certain abuse or a certain event that I just shut it off. Again, that's not free either, because it requires energy and to repress certain emotion. When we escape, suppress, or repress, it's like having a prisoner. If you have a prisoner, you're not free either. You've got to make sure that that prisoner doesn't escape. You've got to keep that prisoner alive. You've got to feed it. You've got to feed that prisoner. So if you have a prisoner and you have this wound that you're trying to escape, suppress, or repress, you're not free. Even though you may be the captor and not the captive, the captor is still not free. Healing physically, spiritually, psychologically, mentally, emotionally is actually no longer being the captive or the captor. That you're free to live your life without the chains of your history, without the chains of the energy and the dysfunction that you've put on your past. That's a whole new opportunity. And so when we have the courage and the willingness and the honesty to look in our point of origin and look upstream, to look at those life-defining events and those life-defining dynamics and see with honesty what were the imprints that were left? How did I orient to those imprints? And where are those imprints creating obstructions in my life now? There are now, thankfully, so many modalities that are available to healing trauma and imprints. There are modalities, obviously, like therapy, breath work, EMDR, tapping, psychedelic, assisted journeys. There's so many things that are available now that help us consciously interrupt some of those old dysfunctions to our history. People ask me all the time, which one is most effective? My answer is always the same. The one that you will do. If someone comes to me and says, I haven't exercised a day in my life, what should I do? My answer would still be the same. Just choose the exercise that you'll actually do. If you enjoy it, do it. If it gets you moving, do it. There is no one right modality. I will say, especially for men, being part of groups or brotherhoods is a massive, massive component. Having support of a system, because we are a tribal creature, we're a social creature, having a sense of a system or a brotherhood or a sisterhood is massively important, because that's really how we are calibrated. We're not calibrated to be isolated and alone, especially when we are dealing with things that are uncomfortable, that are dysfunctional, or that are trapped with shame or with certain levels of taboo. To be able to talk about it, to be able to communicate about it, to be able to relate about it is massively critical to healing some of those old wounds and imprints. So what modality should you choose? The one that you'll do. The one that is going to have you stay in that arena long enough that you can actually start to relearn how to walk in a way that's healthy. Relearn how to be with yourself and be with other people, to relate with your partner in a way that is patient and loving. I don't care what modality you choose it. Choose one that you are going to do and you're going to do consistently, and it's going to keep you in that arena of healing. I hope that framing this big conversation in such a way where we could look at it as imprints rather than it has to look one way, that we could look at it from, there's a broad spectrum where trauma happens on, where wounds happen on, that imprints happen on, that we could look in it in a certain way and then relate and identify in a particular way that makes this usable for you. So as always, thank you for being on this journey with me. Until we meet again, be a good man, live a good life, and determine each of those for yourself.